Hello and welcome to the Homeless Consultant channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. This is part 2 of Existential Threats to the United States of America number 6, which is junk science. And if you haven't seen part 1 of junk science, please watch that. And in there I'll ask you to also watch part 1, which is on cults and cult mentalities, because academia is a cult. And also the 50 greatest existential threats to the United States of America. Those are preliminaries to this. I'm making this video about 9.5 hours after the last one. I had to go to work. Now that I'm out of work, it is extremely cold. You can tell it's snowing, so I thought I'd give you a nice, attractive background so you don't have to focus on me. And let's get right to it, because again, junk science is, I could talk all day and night about it. Alright, so from where we left off, I want to mention there's a couple ways to go about research, in the sense of scientific research attempting to discover truth. One way you can do it is you can observe the world around you, come up with an idea, which scientists would call a hypothesis, and then go out and seek evidence to support your idea. And there's really nothing wrong with that as a method of determining the truth, unless you are so obsessed with proving that your idea is correct that you don't actually worry about the evidence. And in that case, you might end up actually manufacturing the evidence. This happens in anti-smoking all the time. This happens in climate change, things like that. It's not the best way to go about things, but it can get you where you're going to some extent. Another way to go about science is to observe and gather data, and then let the evidence take you where it will. And it's not always possible to do that, and they both have their pitfalls. When you use both in combination, you tend to come up with the best results, but letting the evidence lead you is the best thing to do. But at the same time, you have to think. Remember that example I gave at the end of my last video, where I talked about the footprints in the snow. The evidence leads you to one conclusion, but if you're not a critical thinker, it could lead you in a completely erroneous direction, one that can allow you to cause a lot of harm to innocent other people, which is what junk scientists often do. So, those are just a couple ways to go at this thing called science, trying to determine truth. Junk scientists, though, one thing that they almost by definition have to do, really, they don't have a whole lot of choice, they appeal to unknown and assumed explanations that appear to, on the surface anyway, to support whatever it is that they believe in. And that's exactly what a junk scientist is doing. They come up with some idea. Smoking is the most dangerous thing on the face of the earth. Climate change is going to kill us all. Alright, you come up with these ideas. Jews are subhuman. You come up with a hypothesis, and instead of following the evidence, you go out and you just hunt and search and you look for anything you can find to support what you believe to be true. And if you find something that contradicts that, you might just kind of shove it under the rug and discount it. If you remember ClimateGate scandal with the emails, that's what they were talking about doing there, right in front of everyone's eyes, but they got away with it, didn't they? Because another thing about junk scientists is, unlike a legitimate scientist, junk scientists do not mind lying. In fact, lying is one of their most effective tools for achieving what they're trying to. These unknown and assumed explanations that they come up with to provide an answer for what we observe, it often comes in the form of a story. And don't forget, stories affect people emotionally. They can be presented in such a way that they have what appears to be a moral. If you smoke, then you get cancer. So what do? They pull out someone who has cancer, and they tell you that they used to smoke, or they smoked up until they got cancer. Then they start talking about their children, and I wanted to see my children grow up, and they start crying, and they do all this. That's an emotional story. There's no science there. That's what's called propaganda. There's no science there. Climate change. You want to affect people's emotions? Go grab some little kid like this Greta girl over in Europe, throw her out in front of the United Nations, put her on tour around the world. Just steal her childhood from her. Take it right away from her and make her go out and start repeating what you as a, frankly, an insane adult believes is going on. Just completely ruin her life. So you're going to look for people who present themselves as being scientists, but they keep on telling stories for some reason. They're not focusing on evidence and facts and proof. They're not focusing on the evidence. All right. Now, throughout history, this has been done. Before I get into the different ways to identify a junk scientist, I want to go through the history of this a bit. Way back when people would observe the celestial motions. So if you observe, the most obvious one is the sun rises in the east, goes up and sets in the west. Over the course of the year, at least in the northern hemisphere, the sun, as it gets closer to summer, the sun starts getting higher in the sky till it's overhead. In the winter, it's more on the closer to the horizon. So there's this up and down, back and forth motion as well over the course of a year, as well as the daily motion there. You see Venus come up on the horizon, as the sun's setting, you'll see Venus close by, but Venus doesn't come up up above your head. Other planets like Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, they do. Okay, they don't do what Venus does, so there's different behaviors there. Then you throw in these strange things that no one can explain. Every once in a while you see a fireball in the sky, or you see a comet with its tail, and it just hangs there for maybe days or months. How do you explain that? Well, as they were trying to figure all that out and put it all together, they would come up with fanciful ideas. And once they came up with, because this was their idea, was that the Earth was at the center of the universe. Earth is at the center of everything. And even the sun goes around the Earth. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but if you want to try to prove it, what they would do is they would create what they called epicycles. And an epicycle, if you picture the Earth being at the center and there's all these spheres surrounding the Earth, concentric spheres, and this one has Saturn on it, this one has the Sun on it, this one has Mars, and then, well, how do you account for a comet? A comet comes through once in a person's lifetime, maybe once ever, and it takes some weird trajectory that has nothing to do with the other planets. Well, you have to figure out how to do that. So what they would do is they would come up with this new ring for this comet, only it's more of an oval ring or something. And on the surface, that story seems to tell you what's going on in the sky. It seems to describe it. The problem is, every time you have a new observation, they had to create a new ring or something. And it starts to look like, a gyroscope made up of Swiss watch components. And these epicycles, they would say, well, there's there's this ring that Mars is on, but the ring has an offshoot that ends with a T, and then there's a piston here, and they would just start describing these ridiculous, like some kind of a, what do you call that, I forget what you call those machines, like the mousetrap game and all that, Rube Goldberg device, right? And they would start adding on all these weird attachments and everything. Those were epicycles. And on the surface, if you don't think about it too carefully, it does seem to describe why, for example, the outer planets, they tend to slow down and back up and look like they're going backwards and then go forward again. It's called retrograde motion. And they would come up with all these epicycles, which were just anything they could think of that would explain what they're seeing. But the thing is, it had no relation to the reality. The reality was really, really simple. The sun's in the center, every planet goes around it in concentric circles, and every once in a while a comet comes in from some direction. Really, really simple. Some of the planets have moons that go around them. That's it. Really simple. Nothing to do with that gyroscopic Swiss watch that these master scientists, the equivalent of a PhD back then, would come up with these epicycles. Similarly, when it comes to evolution, when Darwin came out with that theory, they would say, well, there should be, according to my theory, there should be hundreds of thousands of fossils showing intermediate species between the sloth and us, or a monkey and us. And the question was, well, where are all these fossils? There's nothing. There's just basically the same species we have today and some species that appear to be extinct, but there aren't these transitional fossils. There should be hundreds of thousands of them. Don't forget, evolutionists are saying this has been going on for billions of years. Alright, I mean, just look at the graveyards of humans over the last 100. I mean, Minnesota that I'm stuck in, it's only been a state for, about 150 years or so, and yet you can go all over the state and find graveyards just chock full of bodies. Those are humans in there, and those are just the people. You extrapolate that over billions of years, there should be an awful lot of fossils out there, right? But they're not there. But what evolutionists did anyway was they said, well, even though it isn't there, we know our theory is correct. We can't be wrong. We've got a PhD. You know, we've got a theory, a hypothesis. We can't be wrong, so there must be what they call a missing link between chimpanzees and humans, for example. So they're making up the missing link, not because there's any evidence of it, but because that is required for their theory to make even the slightest bit of sense. And frankly, it doesn't make any sense even with that. But on the surface, if you don't dig into it too much, and they say, well, we haven't found the missing link yet, but we know it's there because we know we're right and we can't be wrong. It's impossible. Therefore, the missing link exists. It's just a matter of time before we find it. And then when they find something like Lucy, they say, aha, there you go, missing link. Problem is, Lucy wasn't it. Another thing you find in mathematics, you find something similar. These are what I call, modern epicycles. In mathematics, you'll find constants. Okay, they do the math, and it doesn't work out quite right, but if they insert a constant number, 5.7944, they insert that into the equation, then all of a sudden it works. Now, it's an arbitrary number. It's just the number that made their equation do what they wanted to. So they assume, well, my equation can't be wrong, so this must be the constant. That's loopy. That has no business being in science or math or anything. A lot of the constants are that way, and then you have things like the gravitational constant, which has to exist, but every time they measure it, it's different. Even though it's a constant, you see, it's different. You see why that doesn't work out too well. Another thing would be the Big Bang. This idea that absolutely nothing existed, and then it exploded and became everything. I know, folks, I'm sorry, I wouldn't be discussing this if it wasn't for these junk scientists. Believe me, I would not be telling you ridiculous stories like this. Nothing exploded into everything. That's the hypothesis. That's the idea. These people are so fanatical. It's a cult, remember. Cults behave fanatically, obsessively. They are so fanatical about proving that this is what happened because they don't like the alternative, mainly. The alternative, for the most part, is that a being created everything, and they don't like that. So they can't be wrong. They have to be right. They've got PhDs, they can't be wrong. So, what do? They start doing measurements. They send up all these telescopes, extremely expensive telescopes at taxpayer expense. They gather all this data, and every time they do it, the data really doesn't support their theory. So they say, well, you know what? For our theory to be right, we're missing, X% of the mass in the universe that would have to be there. Maybe 80% of the mass that should be there we can't see, we can't detect it. So rather than saying that, well, our theory's a pile of bunk, they say, well, the stuff must be out there because we can't be wrong. We're PhDs, we're right. It's those crazy creationists who are the loony birds. We're right. Nothing exploded into everything, and we know it's a fact. Right? Even though we weren't around billions of years ago to witness it, but we know it's a fact. So since the only way this theory works is if there's, this much more matter out there and energy out there that we can't detect, then we're just going to call it dark matter, dark energy, and we'll just wait until some future generation discovers it. Because we know it's there. It has to be there. It's the only way that our theory works, even though we can't see it. You see how that works. You see where we're going with this. And you'll be absolutely shocked. I'm not going to go into it because I'll stay on it all day. This is exactly what anti-smokers have done to prove that smoking causes cancer. You can't not make quotation marks when you're talking about junk scientists because they deal in rhetoric and manipulative language. Another thing that came up, again through evolution, vestigial organs. Now, you may have heard, the appendix, your tonsils. Just at one time they said the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, or pineal as some people call it, the thymus. All these, I think there was about 100 organs in the body that at one time or other were regarded by evolutionists as being, quote, vestigial. In other words, excuse me, they were a vestige of back when we walked on our knuckles, when we were swinging from trees with our tail, when we were, reptiles. These are vestiges, so they don't have any purpose anymore. They don't do anything anymore. Well, one of the consequences of believing that as a matter of faith is that it doesn't really matter if you remove the tonsils, does it? It doesn't matter if you pull out the appendix. I mean, they don't do anything. They're vestiges, right? So you see how many people have had their tonsils removed, their appendix removed. But what happens when you remove a thymus? I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. What happens when doctors, the experts, remove a thymus? For the most part, the patient dies, you see, which is exactly what happened in the past. You see, these doctors thought they knew everything, and instead of thinking, maybe it's possible that we're not quite as smart as we think we are, maybe there is a purpose, maybe there's a reason all these organs are inside of our body. Our body's just jam-packed with all these organs. Maybe they actually do something, but we just don't know what it is yet. No, can't be the case. We're scientists. We have PhDs. That can't be the case. We have a hypothesis, for heaven's sakes. We can't be wrong. They must just be useless vestiges from when we were, just grinding our knuckles on the ground. Well, the problem is, tonsils are your first line of defense. They're part of the immune system. They're part of your first line of defense for germs going into your mouth. Now, especially when you're a child. As you get older, your immune system kind of equalizes throughout your body, and different parts are able to compensate for others. If you have your tonsils removed as an adult, it's not nearly as detrimental as having it removed as a child. The appendix as well appears to be part of the immune system and might have other functions, such as replenishing the good bacteria. When you have something like dysentery or diarrhea, and it washes out the good bacteria that you need to digest food. The appendix might be a storage bin to hold that and replenish it. The pituitary gland, the thymus, these are glands that people have called master glands, for heaven's sakes. Like master regulatory. Like if you go into a nuclear power plant and there's that one control panel that you almost need armed guards on it because you just can't let anything happen to that particular control panel or this thing's going bye-bye. That's your pituitary gland, your thymus, pineal gland. Pineal gland regulates sleep and puberty and things like that. Evolutionists used to say that these were just vestiges, just useless, pointless organs. Get rid of them. You can take them out if you want to. They don't do anything. Those did something back when we were crawling on the ground, reptiles, our tails wagging and stuff like that, our ancestors. That's what the experts said. 100 organs in our body that we need to survive and thrive, they would just say they're vestiges and yank them out. And these are doctors, and they would kill people. And I want to emphasize that, because throughout the history of medicine, you're going to find there are very few people who are responsible for more deaths than doctors. And it's because they don't know what they're doing. And their heads are just gigantic with ego and arrogance. They refuse to say, I don't know, and you're going to see that that's a sign of junk science coming up here. Another one is one of the few genuine scientific discoveries in the 20th century, and it's one of the most magnificent discoveries in human history, the discovery of DNA. Now, DNA is, each of our cells, we have about 1 trillion cells in our body, or so they say. Each of those cells has this 6-foot-long string of DNA packed into it, just one part of the cell. All right? It has millions upon millions. I think they're saying, they're claiming billions of these pairs. If you know Gattaca and ACGT, all these pairs and those are what create the genes. The genes, are what with RNA they create proteins. Our bodies are mostly proteins. You just have to add water, a lot of water. You might have heard our bodies are 90% water. Well, add it in with the proteins, and just like one of those power shakes, you got a human, or you got some animal. Alright, well DNA, when they discovered it, they relatively quickly found, or what they thought they found, these pairs that related to genes. Okay, but it was only about 2% of the entire string of DNA. And remember, they're saying that there's billions of these matchings in there. Only 2% of them were accountable for genes. So they didn't know what the other 98% of the DNA strand did. So what did they do? Did they say, well, we don't know, we need to do more research and find out? No. You know why? Because if you say that DNA, this big thing of billions, the more complex it becomes, the more it starts to look like somebody might have actually designed the thing, rather than just happening by random chance. You know, like nothing exploding into everything. And they can't have that, because one of the points of evolution is to kick God out of our lives. The idea of a creator out of our lives. Well, you can't have that. These are PhDs. These are scientists. Okay? So what did they do? They just called that 98% of the DNA strand that they didn't understand, they just called it junk DNA. And you can't miss the irony of them calling it junk DNA when we're talking about junk science. Now, one of the things they did in this was they would say, well, look, there's only... the chimpanzee and the humans, they're 98% similar DNA. Look how close we are together. There's proof of evolution right there. We're barely different than a chimpanzee. Well, that sounds great on paper until you actually look at it, because again, junk scientists lie. They blatantly lie. They cook the books, they cherry pick data, and they manipulate the presentation of science to you, so that you have no choice, unless you go research it yourself, to believe a lie. Well, remember, in the DNA strand, you've only got 2% that actually accounts for the genes. All this other stuff they call junk. When they say that a chimpanzee and a human DNA is 98% the same, they're only talking about what's going on within this little 2% of the whole DNA strand. So here's 2% of the strand, and then they're talking about 98% of that create the genes. But the whole time, remember, they're completely ignoring the rest. They don't know what it is. But someone who has critical thinking skills might just say something like, maybe all this other stuff that we don't understand is what's responsible for making us human, while those things are chimpanzees. And if that's the case, we're not 98% the same. We're like almost completely different, aren't we? Because now this whole thing is different. But that's what they do. So when they say that we're 98% the same, they're not even talking about the whole DNA strand. They're just talking about one tiny portion of it. They're lying to you, in other words. And they're doing it deliberately, because that's what junk scientists do. They lie. They have an agenda. They are not seeking the truth about the world we live in. The death of the dinosaurs. You've probably heard all the different theories or hypotheses, which is what they are. They're just ideas. They're the same thing that a science fiction writer writes down in their books. It's an idea. It's a hypothesis. I mean, there's no evidence for it. Comet hit the Earth, or a comet went by the Earth and it upset our climate, killed the dinosaurs. Asteroid collided with Earth and exploded, and there was a nuclear winter, and all life died out, including the dinosaurs. A giant solar flare hit the Earth and cooked everything. Dinosaurs died. A gamma ray burst from a distant star came here and just smoked everything, right? The Ice Age froze all the dinosaurs and killed the food that they ate, and they died out. And I think my favorite explanation for the reason that the dinosaurs died out came from the cartoon The Far Side. Dinosaurs died because they were smoking cigarettes. And that's par for the course with junk science. Just to tie it back to anti-smoking, the most prolific and by far the wealthiest, most obscene example of junk science of the 20th century. Excuse me, it's getting pretty cold in here. Need a little warm coffee to keep my voice. What I'm going to do next then is I'm going to go over, and again, I wrote these out off the top of my head. I have this kind of thing much better organized in my research and storage. This is the kind of thing I did when I had a home. This is why noisy neighbors would disturb me, why I lost my home, right? But I wrote out, and I just stopped at 20 ways to identify junk scientists versus legitimate scientists. Now, the first way, obviously, isn't even one of these 20. Junk scientists have no respect or regard for the scientific method. Legitimate scientists absolutely regard the scientific method. It's the difference between somebody who obeys the traffic laws. They drive the speed limit, they use their turn signal, they stop at stoplights, etc. They signal when they're turning. The odds of them causing a catastrophe are infinitesimally smaller than the bozo who breaks every single law, never uses their turn signal or puts on the wrong one, drives super slow, drives super fast, runs red lights, doesn't care about anyone else around them. They're a disaster. They kill people. They slaughter people around the country. Car accidents, people dying. That's the way a junk scientist operates. A legitimate scientist at least attempts to obey the laws. Doesn't mean they can't still cause an accident or be in one, but they try to. They are not the threat on the road. It's these madmen, these lunatics who just break all the laws. The law here is the scientific method. The scientific method, by the way, is not absolutely perfect. It's something that's been honed over many, centuries. It's a methodology for determining truth and trying to confirm to the best of our ability that what we have discovered is in fact truthful. And I'm not getting into that just because of time. I mean, I would like to, but just look up scientific method, all right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over 20 ways to identify junk scientists, because for the most part, if you see so-called scientists or people who call themselves scientists doing this, they're probably a junk scientist. The first one I've kind of alluded to already is that they tell fanciful stories and fables, often with a moral of all things. Even though they're the ones who try to kick God and morality out of our lives, their stories often have a moral, such as if we don't address climate change, we're all going to die, and that's a bad thing. Morally bad, bad as in morality. It's a bad thing to do to future generations. You see how the morality is brought in. They tell fanciful stories and fables rather than giving you demonstrable, provable scientific facts. And you see that in anti-smoking, like I told you, they haul in the children. They haul in people who have cancer, or they might haul in an actor who's pretending to have cancer. You see anti-smokers lying all the time about that. That one person, they had one of their anti-smoking ads with someone who was missing an arm in the photo, trying to prove through this storytelling, not through science, but through this picture, this emotional picture, that smoking causes you to be amputated, right? Of course, the person who was in that photo saw it and they were furious because they lost their arm in a car accident. But anti-smokers don't really care about the truth. All they need is a good stock photo of somebody with no arm, because the relationship between smoking and losing your arm isn't very strong to begin with. In fact, it really doesn't even exist. So it doesn't matter. They're telling a story. They just need a picture of somebody who lost their arm. And this person lost their arm. Doesn't matter how. They were born without an arm. They lost it in war. They lost it in a car accident, as happened in this case. Who cares? Like I said, junk scientists lie. So if you see scientists, or what people who call themselves scientists, telling a lot of stories, well, this is what happened with the dinosaurs. This comet came in and it hit the ground and it exploded and particles went into the sky, and they start telling you this story. That ain't science. That's the kind of thing you write down in a fiction book. It's a hypothesis. It's an idea. Okay? One example of this is Easter Island. Easter Island is that place that has those big, tall statues, those mean-looking guys. And when they try to research, well, they still don't really know how those people even got there. It's the most isolated island on Earth, really, that's remotely habitable. And they don't know how the people got there in the first place. But then they died out, and they say, well, the people did this, they cut down all the trees to build these mechanisms they needed to move these statues, and when they did that, they killed their ecosystem, and then they all died out from starvation because they couldn't survive anymore. They killed all the vegetation. Kind of like these stories about, people burning down the Amazon forest lately. Okay, now, they don't know what happened. They don't have the foggiest idea what's going on there. They can't even figure out how they moved those statues yet. Storytelling. Junk science. Number 2 is they make absolute claims and assertions about matters which logically cannot be known. Absolutely. They just can't. For example, how did the universe originate? Sorry folks, if you're going back billions and billions of years, there was no witnesses, there was nobody documenting it, videotaping it, and as you know today, even a videotape can be faked. CGI. A kid sitting at his desktop computer can create a video. I mean, look at all the videos you see on television in science. They'll show you things all the time. Before New Horizons reached Pluto, that probe that went to the planet Pluto, and yeah, I call it a planet. Tough. I call it a planet. When this probe went by there, before it ever reached Pluto, NASA, as well as other scientists, were putting out all kinds of videos of this probe passing by Pluto, right? Those were fakes. That was an artist's rendition. But people had it in their heads that this is what was going on because people didn't know the difference. Because when the probe actually got to Pluto, it didn't quite look like they expected it to, did it? We'll talk about that in a moment. They can't know what happened billions of years ago. They can't know what happened millions of years ago. There's any number of things that might have left no evidence that interfered with what we observe today. Just like the footprint example I gave. If you don't know that it was a drone dropping those footprints, you're going to make an assumption that the footprints were left by the person who left the house, carried the person to the shed, killed them, and then came back dripping blood. But you don't know. You don't know because you weren't there. And the further you go back in history, the more impossible it is to know for certain. And yet these people make absolute claims, vicious claims, when it comes to their opposition. The Big Bang happened millions, billions, and billions of years ago. And if you disagree with me, then you deserve to lose your job and all this. And that's a junk scientist. That is not a legitimate scientist. Wow, it is really cold out here. Number 3 is an obsessive preoccupation. And before I continue, I want to remind you that obsessiveness, preoccupation, fanaticism, that's indicative of a cult. I just want to remind you of this because, if I haven't already said it, academia is a cult. And junk science is intimately related to academia. Obsessive preoccupation with the credentials of the scientist, rather than the quality of the science. You see, if someone comes out and they give a theory or they have evidence or a paper to publish that goes completely against what academia believes, faith, religion, believes is true, like nothing exploded into absolutely everything. I still can't believe in the 21st century I even have to say something like that. But that's their hypothesis. What can I do? If someone comes along and has an alternative view and they have some evidence of it and they want to publish it, the scientists who run this show, who run this farce, they don't want anybody talking about that. They certainly don't want you disproving them, and they don't want you exposing to the American people that for the last 100 years their textbooks have been telling them lies, and that the people who wrote these textbooks were perfectly aware that these were lies. But they had their own agenda that had nothing to do with science. So one of the ways they'll do it is they'll go after this legitimate scientist by going after their credentials. Well, look at their education. They only went to a junior college. What do they know? They don't have a PhD. What do they know? And they'll just start chipping away, trying to all these ad hominem attacks. And if someone points out, well, Einstein was a patent clerk, Well, but his education, blah, blah. You know, it's just, it has nothing to do with science. It's all about attacking people, attacking their credentials, what's on their paper. That's the sign of a junk scientist. And when a junk scientist, or when a scientist, have to do that, is just obsessively preoccupied with their education, their title, I'm a doctor, PhD, their degrees, their honors, their awards. I won a Nobel Prize. You know, like Barack Obama won a Nobel Prize, a Peace Prize, before he had done anything as president. I'll just let you chew on that for a minute. That's how much a Nobel Prize is worth. If you watch my video, The Great Vaping Scare of 2019, you'll find, much to my shock and even my surprise, after I analyzed that whole article, which was one of the most poorly written pieces of scientific babble I've ever seen in my life, I find out that the guy who wrote it, or the girl, or whoever it was, the person who wrote it, won a Pulitzer Prize. Not only was it poorly written, but it was deceptive through and through. So awards don't mean anything. They don't mean anything. How often a person is published. When these so-called scientists are just absolutely preoccupied with that, rather than the evidence and the proof and the science, then it should be pretty clear they're not interested in the evidence and the proof and the science. They're interested in the person's credentials. That's junk science. I don't care what your credentials are. You show me what you got, and we'll take a look at it. That's legitimate science. Junk scientists won't go near it, especially if what you bring to them challenges what they believe on faith. Number 4 is junk scientists tend to have an answer for absolutely everything. It is extremely difficult to get them to come out and admit, I don't know. And if they do come out and say, I don't know, they qualify it. They'll say, well, we don't know right now, but we're doing research, and if we can get some more public funding, we're going to have an answer for this in maybe a year, or maybe 5 or 20 or 50 years from now. Remember the missing link? We don't have any evidence that there should be a missing link, but we're going to assume that there was a missing link, and eventually they're going to find it. Eventually we'll be vindicated, because the only way our theory makes sense is if we assume that there's a missing link, even though there's no evidence for it. It's the same thing here. Junk scientists will not say, I don't know. They want to come across as authoritative, as experts. Experts. Ugh, I'm getting tired of this. They want to show you that they're the boss. They've got the PhD. They know everything. You're just an ignorant member of the ignorant masses. You don't know what they know. You don't have all their esoteric knowledge and their training. You're just a fool, right? Just a sheep to be slaughtered. So they really don't like saying, I don't know. The problem is they don't know. And when it comes to things like what happened billions of years ago, it's logically impossible to know. So when someone comes out and says they do know, they're lying. They're lying. In fact, to some extent, they're actually demonstrating mental illness. I mean, it's that obvious that you can't know what happened billions of years ago. You can observe what's going on today, and you can make inferences and guesses about how that goes back in the past and what might have happened. But since you have no idea what might have interfered with what you're observing today in the interim, i.e. billions of years, then what you're doing is a pointless exercise. It's just an academic exercise. It doesn't prove anything. And anyone who says that it does is demonstrating what I believe is really gets into mental illness, if they really truly believe that. These are not critical thinkers. But the thing is, these people are not dumb. They're deluding themselves because academia is a cult. Number 5 is they claim to have the answer, or they say the matter is settled. To say the matter is settled in science should automatically disqualify. They should be completely thrown out of the scientific world when you say that. That's lunacy. That's the opposite of science. Science says, well, here's what we think we know at this point. Here's our proof. Here's our evidence. Here's the methods we used. We think we have the answer here. We're very, very confident of it. But we're reasonable enough to understand that 50, 100, 500 years from now, something might come up that we can't even conceive of today, and it might turn out that we were completely wrong. For example, you see all these epicycles we have? They explain the motions in the sky, but it's possible that 500 years from now, someone's going to come along and prove that it's the sun with a bunch of planets going around it, something that simple. Junk scientists will not admit that. They say the matter is settled, that's it, we're not even going to discuss it. We're not going to waste our time debating it with you because it's settled. We know the answer. We've got a PhD. We're part of academia. And academia is a cult. Sounds a lot like religions, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like L. Ron Hubbard. He had all the answers too. And if you tried to fight him on it, you're going to lose if you're in Scientology. If you're not in Scientology, what are you? You're an outsider. And therefore you are, as L. Ron Hubbard himself said, fair game, may be destroyed without any punishment by the Scientologist. It's the same thing I'm describing here in what they call science. Whenever you hear a phrase like, the matter is settled, this is settled science, no further research is needed, every legitimate scientist in the world agrees with this. Consensus. Whenever you hear stuff like that, you're hearing from a junk scientist. At the very worst, at the very least, you're hearing from a really bad scientist, someone who is not good at science. In fact, just not good at critically thinking. That's lunacy to say we have the answer. We know it for sure. All of human history is all of history from, when nothing went boom and exploded into everything. All those billions and billions and billions of years and all those millions of years that we evolved from an amoeba into a reptile, into a chimpanzee, into a human being, all of that led up to me, Mr. PhD, because now the matter is settled. And if the universe goes on for another trillion years, they're not going to improve upon what I came up with because it was me who came up with it. You see how this works. Any scientist who says the matter is settled is a liar. Period. And I will go as far as to say, even when it comes to things like Newtonian mechanics, things that even I want to believe are settled. What goes up must come down. If you walk out of the airplane, you're falling down, you're not going up. These things I believe are pretty settled. But I can't say absolutely. There might be more to the story than we understand. I don't know. See, I'm willing to say I don't know. Junk scientists won't, because that makes them look weak, and they're trying to look like a powerhouse. Some big-brained intellectual. And when they do things like this, they're completely the opposite. Their brains look shriveled and incompetent. Anti-smokers have done this all the time. They say, this matter is settled. Smoking causes cancer, smoking causes emphysema, smoking causes this, that, and the other thing. They've got this long litany, just about everything that could possibly go wrong with a person, they attribute to smoking somehow or other. And they say the matter is settled. Well, if you've actually looked at their research, which I have for 30 years, it ain't settled. They've got the worst published science I have seen in any field. It's just garbage for the most part. Just crap. For them to say it's settled science, that's junk science right there. Especially when they come out and say things like, if you smoke, you're going to get cancer. And then you've got 1.5 billion people on Earth smoking their whole lives, and most of them don't get cancer. Seems like someone who's critical thinking might realize, what the anti-smoker said actually isn't true. They said if you smoke, you're going to get cancer. It says so right on a pack of cigarettes. Anybody got a pack of cigarettes for me? Look on the side of it, or at least it used to say, smoking causes cancer. And yet most of the people who smoke never get cancer. You see how this works. You see, it's junk science because academia is a cult. These people hate smokers with a passion. It's a hate group. It's a 500-year-old hate group. Anyway, not to try to focus on the worst example of junk science of the 20th century. Number 6 is that junk scientists will claim that first of all, anyone who disagrees with them. Number 2, anyone who disagrees with their pet theory. Or, number 3, anyone who supports a theory that opposes their pet theory or them. A junk scientist will claim that any of those people are inherently ineligible to even participate in science. That they're just the fact that you disagree with me means that you're a denier. You're just denying me. You're not eligible to participate in science. I know I'm right. I've got all these other scientists, peers, who say that I'm right, so therefore we're right. Forget about the next trillion years where they might come up with a different answer. We're right, because I'm me. Remember Michael Bloomberg? The great scientist Michael Bloomberg? Or the great scientist Al Gore? Oh my God. Running for president of the United States. My goodness. Both of them. Both of these guys, great scientists, they're pumping all this money into science, climate change, and anti-smoking. And they're running for president. I mean, this should terrify anyone who understands junk science and cult mentality, especially academia. When someone says that you disagree with me, therefore you're just not eligible to participate in science, that's a junk scientist, period. Anybody who has a sincere desire to know the truth about the world we live in is welcome to participate in my scientific world. Doesn't mean they'll do good science necessarily, but they're welcome to try, as long as they're sincerely looking for the truth. Number 7 is, I kind of touched on it here, but anyone who disagrees with their pet theory is a, quote, denier. This word denial has been conjured up, and it probably would never have been used if there hadn't been this Holocaust denial, which is a lunacy of its own. There aren't many events in human history better documented than the Holocaust. But all these people came out and they said the Holocaust never happened, so they got the label, they're a Holocaust denier. Well, that is so ludicrous because it's such a well-documented event that these junk scientists hijacked the word denier and they started attaching it. You're a tobacco denier, you're a climate change denier. And what they're doing when they do that, again, it's nothing to do with science. It's all emotional. It's name calling. It's just like the little kid in the schoolyard, you've got cooties. And everyone else is going like, ew, they've got cooties. And everyone shies away from that person and no longer has anything to do with them. It's just childish. Anyone who engages in that kind of nonsense, they're not even adults, let alone scientists, period. I mean, just because you disagree with someone, especially if it's for very good reasons, and you can demonstrate it, if they would give a fair forum to you, that's not a denier. That's somebody who's seeking the truth. That's what you want in science. And when they take the very people who are the best at legitimate science and they call them deniers to try to make everybody distrust and hate them and think that they're incompetent, that's a junk scientist. Nothing to do with science. All rhetoric and propaganda. The word denier. Cooties. Little children in the schoolyard. That's junk science. I mean, their whole obsession is with the reputation of the person, not with the science, the evidence, the facts, the proof, the data. Right there. Hi, sorry to interrupt here, but as it turns out, this particular video ended up being an hour and 40 minutes long, so I'm going to have to split it into 2 parts of its own. So I'm going to split it here. Please come back for part 3.